So today we're very, very fortunate to have as our guest another person who does things that are a little bit more in line with what I do than many of our guests thus far this semester. Kathy Spiegelman is currently the Vice President and Chief of Campus Planning and Development at Northeastern University. This position was created in 2013 to ensure that the university's physical resources keep pace with its core values and ambitions. In this role, Kathy is responsible for effective use of land and buildings on Northeastern's main campus in Boston, its graduate campuses around the country, and other properties owned or leased by the university. After 25 years leading planning and real estate activities for Harvard University, and before the role at Northeastern, Kathy acted as strategic planning and real estate advisor for several private and public clients. At Harvard, she led department reorganizations and mergers to achieve strategic institutional objectives and to gain greater efficiencies. She also led the planning for an evolving 20-year building program for Harvard in Allston. Before her university work, Kathy served in the public sector as the assistant city manager for community development in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where she gained experience in affordable housing, economic development, neighborhood planning, zoning, and urban design. She teaches at the Harvard Graduate School of Design and volunteers on several nonprofit boards and committees. She graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Brown University and holds a Master of Science degree in Historic Preservation from the Columbia University School of Architecture and Planning. Please join me in welcoming Kathy Spiegelman.
Thank you very much, and thank you for sitting forward so it feels like I have a semi-full house to speak to in this large Blackman auditorium. One of my challenges at Northeastern is to figure out, is there the right kinds of meeting space, the right sized meeting space for classrooms and for events? And of course, the answer is always no. There always needs to be more and something else. So George just kind of summarized everything that I'm going to tell you a little bit more about. So you have some of the content of the things that I've worked on throughout the length of my career. And then I am really looking forward to understanding what you're most interested in, either about things that are going on here at Northeastern that affect you, or in general about the field of urban planning or campus planning. So I hope that there'll be something in here that connects to your interest. So I started out, my first job out of graduate school was in the public sector. I took a summer job at the Cambridge Historical Commission and got very interested and active in land use and neighborhood planning. And as a result, I worked on the first set of neighborhood conservation districts in the city of Cambridge, which had to do with field observation, research, and then community process of getting the people who live in their neighborhoods to feel like participants in the planning for those neighborhoods. Then I got more interested in zoning as a tool for helping the planning that goes on in the physical planning in neighborhoods. And in particular, in the city of Cambridge, there were developers who were tearing down houses and building what was called the Arlington Pillbox, basically a square apartment building that really looked nothing like the historic architecture throughout the city of Cambridge. And so we developed a set of regulations that encouraged developers to do something that looked more like townhouses as opposed to pillbox apartment houses. And of course, that was good for a number of years, and then people decided that there were too many townhouses and it had to switch again. But I spent a lot of time thinking about institutional regulations, and in particular, the impact of Harvard University and MIT on the city of Cambridge. And that led to my interest and activity in economic development, working on urban design plans, primarily for abandoned industrial areas in the eastern and western parts of the city of Cambridge, and the creation of public-private partnerships and how to get private interest in improving the public realm around the city. And that then took me to Harvard. I kind of got burned out. Sorry to say it, I was only in my 20s, so you really have no right to be burned out in your 20s. None of you sitting in this audience better even think about burnout. But the city of Cambridge, the politics in the city of Cambridge were very retail. And by that I mean lots of time spent with the politicians out in the community, listening to what people wanted, demanded, were unhappy about. And I decided that maybe I could have more of an impact in the environment by working for an owner, and in particular, in this case, an owner of a lot of land in the city of Cambridge, which was Harvard University. And I went there thinking that I would be there for a little while. I'd do a little teaching. I'd do a little influence on the institution about what they were doing. And then I'd figure out what I wanted to do next. And it took me over 25 years to figure out what I wanted to do next, because Harvard offered so many interesting, challenging problems to try and solve. So I learned what it meant to have a capital plan for an institution that had more money than it knew what to do with. Unlike the challenges here, at Harvard the challenge was on prioritizing what that money was spent on, so that it wasn't spent in ways that didn't deliver maximum benefits. And I got to do open space, transportation, planning for precincts that was very similar to neighborhood planning, and in fact managing the architecture for building projects. So in many ways it was exactly what I had been doing at a citywide level, but doing it for a campus. And then because I had spent the beginning of my career in the public sector, I was very involved in the town-gown relations, which again in Cambridge, for Harvard and the city of Cambridge, were quite contentious. But I was able to keep navigating through those seams of public and private interest for a negotiation for pilot agreements, payments in lieu of taxes for tax-exempt institutions to make voluntary contributions for services and things going on in the community that hosts them. Zoning, and then, of course, rent control. Rent control was a way to try and manage affordable housing in the 1970s and 1980s. It was voted out, and the transition from having rent control regulations that kept the price of rental housing down to a market in a city like Cambridge that was extremely popular to people competing for limited space. Harvard was right in the thick of that, because Harvard owned a lot of apartment buildings that had been subject to rent control. And fortunately, it gave me the opportunity to negotiate an agreement where 100 of those apartment units were transferred at a well below market rate cost to one of the nonprofit affordable housing organizations that worked in the city of Cambridge for sustainable affordable housing. And then the balance over time, as tenants left, became occupied by Harvard affiliates. But the last 10 or so years that I was at Harvard, I kind of pulled back from all of that central planning for the institution and got totally focused on what it would mean for Harvard to create a new campus across the Charles River in Allston, city of Boston. So we acquired property there. We started planning for development. The faculty and students on the Cambridge side of the river couldn't imagine crossing the river to go do anything in Allston. So for most of the 10 years that I was working on this planning, I was negotiating a master plan that could set the stage for what Harvard would do once they actually started building. And that involved thinking over a 20-year period, which most common knowledge is that the good thing about working with institutions, particularly universities, is that they have a long-term time horizon, that we don't think just in, as commercial developers do, of doing a building project or a plan for a building project so that you can get a return on your investment within a relatively short period of time. It's a much longer term commitment that has a multiple bottom line. The difficulty in that is that although you might think that an institution knows what it wants to be in 10 years and in 20 years, the reality is that particularly in the past 10 to 20 years, higher education has been in such a state of transition that anticipating what the program requirements might be 10 or 20 years out, and therefore what you need to be setting a master plan for to do that building, is extremely difficult. When I go out and talk to the deans at Northeastern, I'm having trouble getting them to even give me a 3-year capital plan. Because with the global network growing, with the demands from all of you sitting in this room changing in terms of what you want to prepare you for the marketplace. It's very hard to know now what needs to be done 3 to 5 years from now. And yet, if we don't make some of those assumptions, we won't be ready to provide the space that's needed for those programs when they come. So I left Harvard. I did some consulting for a while. One of my clients was Northeastern University. In the thick of doing an institutional master plan for the city of Boston, I had done an institutional master plan for Harvard in Allston, so I brought the lessons that I had learned to the team that was working here at Northeastern, and eventually was offered this new position as Vice President for Campus Planning and Development. So in addition to what I do here in managing space and real estate and design oversight of the capital projects on the campus, I also continued my teaching at Harvard. I teach in the Graduate School of Design, and I teach the first semester, first year graduate students in urban planning. And it's basically a 13-week semester of everything you ever wanted to know about planning in Boston. And here are the skills that you're going to need to go on to be a planner. So it's been very important to me in being effective in my administrative role, both at Harvard and at Northeastern, to be constantly in touch with the next generation of planners who are really going to make the impact and the difference in what happens to our cities, and in particular the cities of Cambridge and Boston, where I've spent most of my career. So I do capital planning here. I do the master planning. I've researched and been involved in certain real estate partnerships, including the kind of partnerships that it takes for Northeastern's ambition for remote campuses in cities around the country and ultimately cities around the globe. Community development, because Northeastern's campus is an urban campus. We are in the middle of 4 different neighborhoods, and those different neighborhoods have different expectations and desires from this institution. Fenway has an interest in protecting its housing as the costs are escalating, and managing student activity and retail activity along Huntington Avenue. Mission Hill, which is to our west, has recently become full of students. I don't know, how many of you live in Mission Hill? You don't, you're undergraduates, so you all how many of you live on campus? Yes. That's what we're trying to do, is to, as Northeastern has gone from being a commuter campus to becoming a residential campus, there's still many more students than the housing on campus can provide for. And so in the last negotiation with the city, Northeastern committed to requiring undergraduates in their freshman and sophomore years to live on campus, but then many juniors and seniors actually find housing off campus where they can have they can share apartments and therefore maybe have lower cost, and they don't have to be managed by the residential advisory folks who manage the housing on campus. As a result, many students have found Mission Hill as a place where they want to go and live, and unfortunately, some of the behavior of students, I'm sure this doesn't apply to anybody in this room, tends to lead to party gatherings of a lot of students marching up the hills in Mission Hill to find who's having the party. And as a result, the other people who live on Mission Hill feel that the quality of their life is negatively impacted by the students. So there's a lot of pressure on Northeastern to build more student housing. And the university has been resisting that pressure because, to go back to what I said about higher education changing, with the co-op program, with the global reach of the way Northeastern is delivering its product of higher education, Northeastern doesn't want to find itself committed to the fixed assets of more housing than the student demand requires. So while simultaneously acknowledging the political impacts and quality impacts of our institution and the people who are part of this institution on our surrounding neighborhoods, we also have to be true to the academic mission and the future aspirations of the institution. So when you then move to our south, the southern border of Northeastern's campus is Roxbury. Roxbury is actually a community that has been very recently welcoming to Northeastern doing more at that edge because they believe that it will stimulate more private investment in an area that has mostly had to depend upon public investment for quite a long period of time. And the history of Roxbury and what the government has done in terms of urban renewal and clearance and highway projects is actually quite sad. And in fact, this semester, my students at Harvard Graduate School of Design are focusing entirely on the Roxbury neighborhood and planning over there. So I get to have them do something that I think has meaning for what I'm doing here at Northeastern as well. So on the Columbus Avenue side of the campus, you may have noticed that there's a major construction site. And you may know that that major construction site is a hole in the ground anticipating a 225,000 square foot science research building. That's the first of its kind at Northeastern because it's going to be laboratories, classrooms, and faculty offices for the College of Science, the College of Engineering, the Bouvet College of Health Sciences, and the College of Computer and Information Sciences. And it is expected to be ready for occupancy in the end of 2016 or the beginning of 2017. And the project includes something called the ARC, which is a bridge to be built over the railroad tracks and make the connection. So this sort of comes from all the time I spent trying to think about connecting the Harvard campus in Cambridge to the Harvard campus in Alston, where we had to cross a river. Here we only have to cross a railroad track, which is noisier, less aesthetically pleasing, but a shorter distance and easier to think about doing. So the importance of that project is not just going to be the academic program of bringing the disciplines together, it's actually going to be bringing the campus together. And it's going to mean that our edge in Roxbury becomes a much more active part of how we do our physical planning around the campus. I think that's going to be the end of my remarks, and the rest, I hope, is questions from you, and I'm sure questions from George. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Kathy, so much for coming. And there's so much to cover, actually. Between your work at Harvard and now your work here, you are covering, and in Cambridge before that, you know, are covering such a significant part of the sort of the urban area that's in play. When I say in play, I mean stuff that's really going to be changing. But I wonder if we could get started by really talking about the fundamental move that you made 25 years ago, I guess, to go from public planning into institutional planning, because it seems to me they're super different contexts, and since so much of what we talk about in this class is about the context and about identifying exactly what problem is being addressed, maybe you want to talk just a little bit about how those two realms are different, how the public sector is fundamentally different from the private sector, especially, I guess I would say, in terms of maybe one could say that the university is like the last vestige of single author planning, where there's a, you know, if in the old days, if in the days of...
Am I the author of the plan here?
No,
that's
no,
great
no.
news.
No. But they do
really
tend to have, you know, universities tend to have a president
yes.
that is more like the people who planned Paris, or who planned Washington, D.C., or who planned Philadelphia, what I would call the sort of grand, more single author type of plans than the much more interactive, participatory kind of planning that you were alluding to for most of your talk.
I don't disagree with that, except that I think, because my experience has been locally in this metropolitan area, the city of Boston in particular and its institutional master plan requirements have done a lot to try and bring the institution into the discourse with the rest of the city.
Right.
On the other hand, just from a personal professional point of view, to be a planner in the public sector is to try and anticipate what you might get other people to do. So you can write regulations, you can permit a project, you can try and build consensus and political support for something. But you actually need somebody else to do it, particularly now. At the start of my career, there was a lot of public money, and the urban design things that we were doing in the city of Cambridge, we got lots of federal grants, and so we felt like a developer.
Right, right.
For me, the difference of going to an institution or representing an owner with a large portfolio of multiple use property was to actually be in a position to make the decisions for something to happen.
Right, right, right.
So the frustration when you're on the public side as a planner is that what happens if someone won't make the investment or make the action? Sure. The frustration when you're on the private side is, what if the public sector won't let you do what you think you need to do? And they're very different, but your mindset has to understand both.
Yeah, no,
I think to be successful.
I think that it's really interesting, and I think we have so many international students at Northeastern and in this class that it might be worth pointing out that the United States is, at least traditionally, a very different place than almost every other country in the world when it comes to precisely these things, because generally our government, certainly in recent years, is involved very little in being the author of development. And at one time it was, at certain times it has been to a greater extent, but in most countries, it's far more of the development in major urban areas comes from government instigated enterprises. And I think that's one of the fundamental cultural differences that manifests itself in the built environment here.
And I think when government tried to be the developer, meaning the urban renewal era in the 60s, we didn't do such a good job of it. So
completely right. I mean, one could say it's terribly bad timing that the coincidence of that government engagement with a moment in architecture and urban design thinking that perhaps wasn't as prescient as it imagined itself to be.
Correct.
Maybe has sort of fouled the nest for 50 or 100 years, but we'll see. And we'll actually get back to that, because when we talk about preservation, I think there's a lot there. I wonder, you've been doing this for a while. How have the tools that you use and planners use changed in the last 25 or 30 years? I can think in architecture, of course, the design tools have changed enormously as we've gone just from ink on Mylar to complex three-dimensional models that can be edited on the fly and sourced and costed and so forth. But from a planning perspective, how has that world changed?
I think it's driven by technology. It's driven by access to big data.
Right.
So being able to predict and project what's going to happen has a lot more content meat to it. So a lot of being, in my mind, a lot of being a planner is trying to see ahead of where people are looking right in front of them, and try and get people to give enough information about what their life is like, what the quality of their environment is like, what they hope it to be in the future, so that you can actually anticipate what's coming. So you have to have some vision. If you have data, if you have ways of reaching more people than whoever happens to show up at a particular zoning hearing, which you can do now with the internet and all sorts of social media, you have the opportunity to actually bring a community's viewpoint along with you and have the vision be shaped as something people can see.
Right. It's interesting. It seems to me that, if you think about, let's say, the extremes, we'll talk more about different types of campuses, because I think that's a meaningful distinction. But there's also different types of planning practice when it comes to campuses, and it seems to me they are very much a child of the changing technological environment. I think of, at one end of the spectrum, a firm like Ayer St. Gross in Baltimore, which is a firm that does a lot of very formalist planning of campuses. It's very visual. It's very much about creating an aesthetic sensibility that communicates a message. Think a campus that was mostly, parking lots and became very leafy. And that leafiness is supposed to connote or communicate certain qualities of an academic character. At the other end of the spectrum, take a firm like, let's say, I would say the local firm Sasaki, which is very data-driven and therefore produces now it's solving a completely different problem.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting for people to think about that. When you think campus planning, you might think a series, well, where's the new dorm going to go? Or how many square feet should the research building be? Or some such thing like this. But actually, they can be tied together. You know, all this data can be interconnected now in ways that are far more predictive.
So, to me, it would not be a success to have one without the other.
Right.
Because I do think campuses have a responsibility and an obligation to think about sense of place. I feel like just meeting the program by saying there are enough rooms, there are enough seats, is not, in this marketplace, it's not going to succeed.
Sure, sure.
Because I think what you do when you come to an undergraduate university or when you come to do research is you're committing to something that involves a sense of community, and that sense of community should be reflected in the decisions that are made about the physical.
Yeah. Well, this is where we were sort of chatting about this on the way over here, but I mean, this is where things get so interesting, because I don't know that all the students are aware maybe of how many, you know, we talk about solving the right problem a lot in this class, and also about how design is sort of an approach or a methodology that allows you to solve multiple problems at the same time, and that's really what we're talking about. We've got, okay, residential character. What is it like to be a student living in a dorm at Northeastern? What is the experience of going to the dorm and going to the dining hall and going to class and going to work out? What's that all like? Then research space. Then also identity for prospective students, it seems. Like, in other words, there's, like, when you guys make presentations, let's say to the president or to the city, do you speak in terms of different audiences? Like, for example, here's what we're doing to address the undergraduate, the quality of life of current undergraduates. Here's what we're doing to address the quality of life, let's say, for research scientists or postdocs or something like that, which is another important constituency. And then now we're doing it in places that aren't in Boston. We're doing it in Seattle, we're doing it in Charlotte, and I think other places. How do you start taking that and translating a kind of ethos of one place? I think they call it, what do we have at the core campus, 56 acres or 59 acres?
Yeah.
Something like that. How do you translate that to other places?
It's a really good question, because there are very few audiences that are taking in the breadth of all of that.
Right.
Faculty mostly care about their office,
right.
their parking,
right.
and whether or not the classroom where they have to teach smells or doesn't have the right technology.
I should interject here that we are a noble class of citizen, the faculty member, always thinking of others.
Yes. Alumni frequently think about what it was like when they were here.
Right.
And if it's changing, you want to make sure that you don't wipe out everything they remembered, because then they're not likely to come back and give you donations to do the things that you want to do.
Right.
And the students, I'd actually ask the question, I'd love to hear people in the room, the common thinking is when you go around and you look at campuses to pick where you want to go, even though I know you're thinking about who are the faculty, what are their strong programs, what's the financial aid package they're going to give you, you're also looking at where would you live, what is the food like, what do the other students on campus look like, do they look like a community that I want to be a part of? You probably come tour with your parents, and your parents are looking for something slightly different. Is it going to be a safe place? Is it going to propel my son or daughter along their educational path and career path the way I want it to go? And you have to be thinking about all of those different tiers, but there's very few people who are looking at all of them together.
That's such a great insight. I think it's completely true. Later this semester, we're going to be doing an experience. We're going to have someone give a presentation just on experience design, and then they're going to do an experience map as an assignment. And you know, some of them will probably choose to do. I'm speculating aloud. Will probably choose to do an experience map of Northeastern, and one could do it using different audiences, and they would be wildly different experiences, as you just described.
I would love it if any of you pick to do that you share it with me.
Yeah.
Because I don't get to hear the student perspective directly as much as I'd like. You hear it from student government, you hear it from the residential life folks, but in my work, I don't have as much interaction with students themselves. So if you do an experience map of the campus, it would be really interesting.
Well, you know, of course, what we're trying to do is get very methodical and intentional about breaking apart complex things so that you can tease out which things are super successful. It may be, for example, that, you know, when you do this, you realize that, wow, at Northeastern, for example, we keep trying to make this aspect of student experience better when, in fact, it's already really good, and there's this other thing that everyone hates, and we don't even know about it. And, you know,
I bet I know about everything that you guys hate. You tend to hear about the complaints more than you hear about the kudos for things that are going right.
I wanted to get into the details a little bit more about distinguishing, let's say, what we're calling the problem to be solved in some different settings. Let's say, for example, and you can tell me if this is a bad parallel, but let's just say the singular engineering research building that we're doing right now and the planning that sort of went into that, there was kind of a master plan that then this is in service of. And comparing and contrasting that then with the Alston stuff, either the Harvard Alston plan of, you know, at its most ambitious, let's say at the end of the Summers presidency, or in its sort of revised state now. Because it seems to me, the engineering building here at Northeastern is more, even if it is community facing, it is still like completely part of the traditional footprint of Northeastern, as opposed to Alston being truly an outpost. And I wonder how the planning for those two things might be different.
So let's just start with the fact that Harvard's campus is 375 years old, has a lot of historic values in their buildings and a lot of historic restrictions, and is surrounded by residential neighborhoods. Whereas Northeastern's campus is not as old, not cherished physically as long, and bordered on some areas that don't have neighbors, in fact have empty parcels, meaning the south, you know, on Columbus and Tremont Street, and on Huntington, commercial. So the physical nature of the problem is different to start with. I think, you know, Harvard, the business school and the athletic facilities were already across the river, so it wasn't totally foreign territory. But I think Harvard, because of the nature of its campus and history, felt that its growth and future depended upon doing something that was almost adjacent. Whereas Northeastern is much more engaged with thinking about online education, hybrid education, graduate studies elsewhere that can take advantage of what's here on the campus. And the physical master plan here is much more about buildings that are not considered so precious being replaced, or parking lots being converted, which is what's happening for the science and engineering building, as opposed to we need to find a big plot of land that's close enough to us that there's more Harvard next to Harvard.
No, it's interesting. I appreciate, you know, as you know, I mean, I've followed all of this for a long time myself, and it is the idea about whether one is trying to replicate the 375-year-old campus on the Cambridge side of the river, or one is trying to reinvent for the 21st century an enterprise that's meaningfully different, is, I guess, epitomized by the two buildings that, like, maybe most recently were done over there. And I'm thinking of the Machado Savetti's graduate dorm at one end of the spectrum, and Bob Stern's Spangler Hall at the other end of the spectrum.
And now there's a Bill Rawn executive ed building, so they're imitating Northeastern. That's the architect that did all the West Village buildings.
That's right.
But I spent a long time at Harvard, and when I left, I felt like I had learned what I needed to learn about university planning, and it wasn't really what I was going to be doing. But I found that the complexity of the problems and the nature of the opportunity to affect an urban environment through what an institution, a university does, was so appealing that among the half dozen clients I had as a consultant, I kept being drawn to what was happening at Northeastern. But the situations couldn't be more different. You know, Harvard was all about understanding and protecting a brand that's been unbelievably successful. Northeastern is all about opening its eyes and arms to a new kind of brand. And so the nature, when you talk about values being represented by what you're doing physically and with the real estate, it's very different.
No, and by the way, that, of course, that is a huge draw from my perspective at this institution too. Is it's, I think maybe for the students, they might, because it's presumably the first university that they've been an undergraduate at, the willingness of this institution to take on, embrace change every single year is just, I don't know any place that
on the other hand, as a planner, you never know what's coming next, and so it can be quite a challenge.
Right. A couple other questions. I'm going to zoom out a little bit about other campuses and maybe campus types, because again, most of these students are not design students, so it's not reasonable to assume that they all kind of are familiar with the sort of major campuses in the United States, but a few that are probably known to them by physical experience nearby, certainly Harvard's campus, but also MIT's, I would say NYU, I would say University of Virginia, certainly, you know, and Northeastern are all very different kinds of campuses. I mean, I would say, you know, the sort of, you know, urban campuses, there's the kind of precinct kind that has a wall around it that, you know, you're either inside the campus or you're in the city. The other end of the spectrum is probably NYU, which doesn't really have any campus space of its own. It has buildings that exist in the city, and you live in Greenwich Village or Washington Square, and you happen to go to different buildings that your classes are in. It's a completely different end of the spectrum. What are your favorite campuses in the U.S.?
Well, having been a student of design and planning and architectural history when I was an undergraduate, I love the University of Virginia. To me, there's nothing like it, but I've never lived in an environment like that as an adult. I've never wanted to be in something that's that low density, because I thrive on all of the different things that happen in an urban environment. If I just think about MIT and Harvard and Northeastern and BU and BC, until I came to work here, I probably would have said Harvard was my favorite campus. There's parts of the MIT campus that I love, but it gets very quickly into feeling like it's part of Kendall Square, and the campus sort of dissipates. But now that I'm here, and I have no choice but to spend all my time here, the excitement and variety on this campus, and the idea that when you're inside it, you definitely see how much effort has been put into planting and pathways and making many not terribly distinguished buildings from an architecture point of view feel like they're surrounded by something that creates a good environment. And part of what I hope we're doing with some of the planning that we're doing on Columbus Avenue and Huntington is making that sense more engaged with the city. I think although we're an urban campus, and student life, I'm sure, crosses Huntington Avenue, goes over to Columbus if you live in any of those properties over there, it still feels internalized. And because of the co-op program, because of the nature of the values here, I feel like it should be more permeable. And I think this bridge over the tracks, which is a part of this new research building, is a huge investment by this institution in saying, yeah, if you live in Roxbury, our campus should be on the path for you to go to the Fens. And if you live in Fenway, you should feel safe and encouraged to come all the way through to Roxbury.
You know, just an aside there, I have to say, from a planning standpoint, it's hard to overestimate the importance of the design of Ruggles Station, even if, regardless of whether you think it was necessarily well built from a construction quality standpoint. The urban design planning idea of quote unquote crossing the tracks with that grand barrel vaulted space before there was anything to connect. Let me be clear.
That's right.
You guys would be stunned if you saw that building. Ruggles Station was designed in 1980. Well, it was executed in 1986, probably designed in 1982. And there was nothing but like vacant lots on either side of that. You might think, talk about a bridge to nowhere. It certainly looked like one when it first happened, but it spawned precisely the whole reason that International Village and all that stuff works is because that infrastructure was laid. And I take your point that this engineering research building will provide another layer of that kind of
But I think the real challenge on that in Lower Roxbury is there are still so many vacant urban renewal parcels that were cleared when the idea came about that there should be a highway.
Right.
It was replaced by the idea of a park, and the orange line was moved, and all of those things that Northeastern could be an agent for have not been sufficient catalyst to make things happen on the other side of Tremont. And I think that's about to change, which is very exciting.
It is. I mean, I think it's also, I mean, this is a little bit of a digression, but it's not, because politics and culture are intimately intertwined with our participatory way that we do planning in the 21st century, almost everywhere.
Correct.
You know, we've hosted conferences here and in Berlin on the public review process. And it's surprising. I expected it to be far more different than it turned out to be. In Berlin, it was just as ornery and contentious as it is here, just about different things. But the names were changed, but the themes were very similar. That it was very contentious, and that's the way it's going to be. But in any case, the political business I think there's been a kind of generational change in leadership in Roxbury and Dudley and in City Hall that has allowed the horrible things that were done to that community by transportation planners and urban planners in the late 50s and early 60s. And you look at pictures of what Melania Cass Boulevard looked like prior to, you just can't believe it.
Yeah.
But in any case, the economic demand, the institutional relationships are now such that I think that I agree with you. I think Melania Cass Boulevard is actually, they're already building some things on it, but I think more will come, and that, you know, if we can connect the BU medical area via Melania Cass Boulevard to Northeastern, that just makes, and then to Longwood.
And it's understandable that some of that takes time, but it also takes an investment in trust. I think one of the things I learned in the public sector that I've always carried with me in my private work is that you cannot assume that somebody different than you or who has a different stake trusts you or trusts anything that you say. So unless you say that's important and I have to build and demonstrate that trust and credibility, you have much less opportunity to make new things happen.
I wish I could say that I asked you to say that. I did not, but there's no better parallel with one of the 5 terms that we use in this course. The first one, empathy. That in designing anything, you have to understand the world from the other's point of view, and as a planner, more than anything, because you are your customer in a way is 5,000 people or 10,000 people who are associated with the scene that you're talking about. In Alston, it wasn't just the abutters, it was the community rightly said, you know, you're going to utterly transform our community. We would like to know what you're thinking about. And that's probably not unreasonable. What happens then, actually, when I would say, when that trust exists, is that the community gets oftentimes less resistant and actually more engaged and willing to work towards an outcome that it can actually happen, as opposed to the kind of black and white, all one thing or all another.
So in addition to being obligated to build more housing on campus because of the problems that have been created in Mission Hill, the master plan, the most recent master plan, which just got approved at the end of 2013 for Northeastern, also included hiring goals for people from the community and investment in small businesses from the community and real evidence of we all go here together.
Well, see, that's great because those are actually deliverables. Do you know what I mean? If it gets to that stage, that's a good sign, because that's actually something that you can do. When oftentimes before you get to that stage, and Kathy and I have lived in different slices of this world. I've run a bunch of public review commissions for the city on major projects where my job is to sort of translate community interest through a committee and communicate it to the BRA. And you know, when you get to the point where there are actual specific things that the community is saying they're interested in, that's actually far better than where it usually starts, which is, I don't trust you, I loathe you, I don't want anything to happen, which is often the starting point. We talked for a minute about Virginia, and it was a good guess that you would like that campus, because I don't know any urban designer or campus planner who doesn't like the Thomas Jefferson's academical village in Charlottesville, Virginia. But it does raise a question about master planning in general, which I think is very relevant, and that is, what do you think, or tell me what you think about the time frame of master planning? You were saying earlier, you know, we like to think about, the cool thing about universities is they have a time frame that's much longer than a private real estate developer. Absolutely true. No question that that's true. The best private real estate developers have an investment in an area, so they too have a longer time frame. Think Norman Leventhal or good quality developers, Millennium Partners. Not always true of your fly-by-night guys. But if you think about the time frame of an institutional master plan, which is very specific, the Boston Redevelopment Authority asks universities like Northeastern and BU and Harvard to submit a plan for 10 years, right? It's supposed to, this is basically what we're thinking about doing roughly, and at least in terms of gross square footage and location, what we're planning on doing in the next 10 years. But you know, Jefferson's vision is 200 years old, and at least it still informs parts of UVA's campus, increasingly small parts, I'd concede. But Pierre L'Enfant's vision for Washington, D.C. continues to inform its development very, I would say very strongly. What do you think about the difference between that kind of very strong, let's say Daniel Burnham, or, you know, very strong French kind of rational planning that has a very specific vision? This is our 50-year plan for what this area will look like. Think some new capital city. It's often capital cities are like this. Canberra, Australia, they designed a whole new capital only like 20 years ago for the whole nation. It's an extremely specific, prescriptive thing. Where do you come down on, or maybe it's an unfair question, but where do you come down on that kind of prescription that answers questions for the next generation versus a kind of, we don't know what's coming around the bend, so we need to be flexible and nimble?
So this might sound like a cop-out, but I actually think it's both. I think that good planning is visionary, that good planning sets a framework that allows for flexibility to happen. I mean, I actually think Jefferson's University of Virginia did not have sufficient flexibility, and that's why it's sort of become a little precious. Right. But the concept of what that was about, when it happened, and how he thought about it is just, has influenced everybody's thinking about campus development after that. Right. If you think about Paris or Washington, D.C., and of course, you know, L'Enfant was a piece of it, but then his ideas got, and had political endorsement. I think it takes political leadership and political will to be able to move that framework, you know, whether it was filling in the Back Bay or Olmsted's plan for open space to guide development in the city. And now I think we have the challenge of resilient planning and thinking about what do cities do to anticipate that the conditions at our water edges are going to change. And I don't think you can be just totally flexible saying, well, we're not sure when the wave is coming or the sea rise is coming. You need to set a path, but that path needs to not be so rigid that you miss something.
Well, this is, you know, this is so interesting, and it's a great framework for actually looking at the development of our cities and our built environment over the last 40 years, or 50 years, because we had the kind of utopian moment after the Second World War and into the 60s where certainly big ideas were at play, big strategic directions about getting rid of slum housing and replacing all of it with healthful, modern living spaces, altering our transportation infrastructure completely and utterly. That was a period of taking on big, big challenges. The consequence, of course, was, and this is a lens that I look at this stuff through anyway, is it's a battle between regional and local interests. Regional interests are the ones that have an interest in keeping the oceans out, keeping employment at an acceptable level, and getting transportation infrastructure and goods and services to market. But if I live in a neighborhood that's just a little sector of that region, and I feel that the consequences of those regional improvements, think Robert Moses in New York, are devastating to my local fabric, well, that then explains the decades of the 70s and 80s and 90s maybe, in which no big issues were taken on and everything was deferential to circumstance. So in a way, embedded in the question is how, and I don't expect there to be a 100% clear answer, but how do we balance the need to take on large forces on the one hand that do require big ongoing commitments of decisions and resources with the necessity to be flexible and deferential to circumstances that cannot be known always in advance.
If you have a good crisis, that's one way you can get people to go beyond the way governance works here, which does not favor regional thinking and regional planning. I think the other thing is to really understand stakeholder interests and try not to blow by them, but to actually build a pyramid off of them so that people understand that it isn't about wiping out this in order to make that happen, but that you find a way to weave things together so that everybody sees that they're getting something in the end.
You know, I have, in my office, I have a copy of Boston's 1930 Transportation Plan. It's a nice beige hardcover book. It's not a CAD file. It's a nice book with an introduction, and it has several sections that fold out, and you can see an aerial photograph of a section of Boston. And then it has an onion skin or translucent sheet that you overlay over that aerial photograph, and it shows, the city at the moment it was suddenly radically transforming to accommodate the automobile. In other words, we've got to make some big changes, people. But it's interesting because while clearly there are lots of properties that are going to be adversely affected here, there is also a vision of the good thing that's going to happen as a result of it. And I wonder if, as our digital tools evolve, if one of the things that maybe holds out some hope for us is that the ability to visualize the whole, the region, and the benefits that accrue to the region will help maybe the average citizen understand why something's happening on their block.
True, but I think we have to be really careful that those digital tools don't mislead people into thinking that you can make everything good for everybody. Because I think there has to be some realism to the fact that there will be some people who come out better than others. So my worry about the digital tools is that people see something, they get real excited, they're willing to support it, and then it actually happens and they're like, really? That's not what the pictures showed. That's not what the maps showed. So I think we have to use those tools.
Yeah, well, I wonder if this embedding them with the data streams that you were describing earlier isn't actually the answer here. Several of our colleagues here at the university are working on this kind of stuff now, and the idea of being able to have visualization and a kind of, let's say, barometer of a pain barometer for certain sites. I think, I totally agree that the more transparent we can make this, the better, because we wouldn't have to make it transparent if we had kings and pharaohs and the kinds of people who actually built most of the cities that we admire when we go on our tours. This should be said out loud more often, that the cities that we admire the most, none of them just about were built under a the kind of democratic structure that we have today.
That's correct.
And it's important to realize that, because otherwise people go to Paris and they go to Rome and they say, yeah, I liked that. How come you guys are building this crap? Huh? Why are you building these big faceless buildings? I want it to be more like Rome. Well, there's some reasons it's not like Rome. This is what we were talking about on Greater Boston the other night about the Seaport District. Why is the Seaport District not look more like traditional Boston? I want it to look more like the North End. Well, the North End, the plot sizes were determined in the 1780s, and they barely accommodate living dwelling unit sizes, right. 3 or 4 per piece, whereas in the Seaport District, the parcels are designed to accommodate the kinds of buildings that developers need to build today.
You can affect what happens and gets built by how you lay out the parcel sizes,
right,
but
right.
By what the transportation network looks like, by whether it has public transportation. Those are all the things that you can plan for from on top,
yep.
and then allow things to bubble up in that context.
Yes, and the scale of the Seaport District in many ways was set in stone by the giant dimension of the Ted Williams Tunnel, yep. which takes you to the airport. It's a great thing, and it's a wonderful development regionally. It does have a bit of a local cost in terms of...
and it happened that way in order to avoid some political obstruction from other proposals that preceded it. So Boston's history is very interesting. You need to understand the political history in order to understand the physical history.
Well, I take my students, I haven't taken this group up, but in my, our freshmen in architecture, I take all of them up to the top of the Prudential Center, mm-hmm. so that you can see the city from above, and you can start to understand how in this city, and as with many in campuses, you're just doing it on purpose, more for good, whereas lots of times cities, the transportation infrastructure in Boston ends up being the barriers between neighborhoods that maybe didn't necessarily really like each other that much, and
right.
they definitely wanted to keep one separate from the other. These are very natural barriers in a city like Boston that is not an egalitarian grid like Chicago. Mm-hmm. It's not an egalitarian grid like the above Houston Street in New York. So that's super interesting. And those are the levers that, as you say, you can use as a public planner or as a campus planner, mm-hmm. I think, in shaping mm-hmm. what comes next. One of the things that's made Northeastern's transformation in a way so possible is it's not on the fabric of even the Fenway. It was on fabric that never really had buildings on it. It was right. the rail yard. It was empty, crazy, irregular, big parcels near rail lines that were then big enough later to have the kind of buildings that we need today built on them.
Right.
Which it's super interesting. The scale of when the infrastructure of your place got laid out.
Yeah.
Dictates an enormous amount.
Absolutely, I agree.
Yeah. Please remember to send questions that you may have for Kathy via Twitter to the hashtag #UnderstandingDesign. I just wanted to tease out a couple more things with you directly. Preservation. Let's just talk just for a minute about preservation, because it's such an interesting topic about what animates preservation, historic preservation. We did very little of it until the enormity of regional interests in the 50s and 60s started indiscriminately, it appeared to many citizens, blasting away the historic character of especially East Coast cities or historic cities, and also replacing it with an architectural style or character that seemed very much at odds. I'm thinking brutalism at the one end of the spectrum, but just lots of exposed concrete, yep. very structurally expressive work that bore no resemblance to what came before it. How have you surely had to deal with lots of different kinds of preservation, mm-hmm. whether it is preservation of a single, let's just go over very quickly what the general criteria are for preservation. One is George Washington slept here. That is a building, irrespective of actual architectural
right.
quality, a really famous thing happened there, so we're going to preserve it as a moment in our history for some other reason. The second is a building of tremendous architectural quality that people think, for example, we should have saved Penn Station in New York and we didn't, but we're definitely going to save others that are that everyone agrees are of great merit. A third is neighborhood character, mm-hmm. which kind of emerged later, I would say, in the preservation discussion, where whole historic districts, and certainly Cambridge, half of Cambridge maybe is a historic district, and Beacon Hill and parts of the Back Bay, they have their own historic overlays that say there are additional hurdles you have to clear to change things in this place. But now there's an emerging, let's say, fourth one, or maybe it's a variation on an earlier one. Suddenly, some of that 50-year-old concrete architecture, some of it is called brutalism. The best known example in this town is Boston City Hall, but there are many others, is now coming up for preservation of its own. And super interesting topic, because on the one hand, in many cases, a case can certainly be made for the unique architectural character of one of these buildings. On the other hand, sometimes they stand directly in the way of the kind of planning evolution that one would expect, and that the sort of incrementalism by which our cities usually transform. Tell me about, on Harvard's campus, of course, there are buildings by Joseph Louis Sert. Both the big ones that I'm aware of have been incrementally transformed and improved over the years and made more connected, let's say, more urbanistically friendly. But there are many buildings, I don't know if there are, I can't think of any on Harvard's campus right now, but there are lots. City of Cambridge just tore down a big concrete building, the Martin Luther King School on Putnam, and is replacing it with another building. But where do you come down on, because this seems like this is a big issue that's not going away in preservation, about how to draw the line between, or what the variables are in making those decisions. How about that?
So I'm not one who thinks we need to preserve things from that period, that early modernist period, if they're not successful. If they're not working as a part of the city today, I don't think the problems of Boston City Hall require it to be demolished. And I feel like what it represents almost at the landmark status, as opposed to on a vernacular basis, we want mid-century modern. So I think for me, preservation is always about context too. So it isn't just a singular edifice. It's what that building represents in terms of the life around it, whether it's a neighborhood or it's a town center, or, Harvard has William James Hall, which is
by Yamasaki.
Not a building that anybody really likes. It certainly doesn't fit in. But there are things you could do to the first floor of that building to make it more pedestrian accessible, as opposed to saying it doesn't belong there. On the other hand, preserving it because it's a Yamasaki building doesn't make any sense to me. So I think the only reason Harvard doesn't take it down is because they'd never get that much floor area to replace it. And so the developer mentality is not to get rid of it.
I just think this is so interesting. By the way, I agree with everything that you just said, but you and I are in not necessarily the majority opinion on a lot of this within the architecture and design profession, and I'm stunned at the degree to which people are willing, other architects, prominent architects, architecture faculty members, people, let's say thought leaders in the architecture profession, are willing to throw almost everything except their preference for a very, frankly, idiosyncratic language of architecture that never achieved a great popularity. Almost as soon as many of these buildings were completed, their owners and users were retreating from them. Indeed, even the authors of these buildings forswore designing in that vein ever again. You know what I mean? These are clues that you don't have to be Sherlock Holmes to think that there might be some reasons why some of these buildings are not actually, if we claim as designers all the values that I think good architecture and good design bring to the built environment, if we make these claims when they are not satisfied, we need to be the ones who stand up and say that. And I'm delighted to hear you say that, because it continually freaks me out when they're built. Now some of these, and CERT is an interesting character, because Boston University is also dramatically altering the BU Law School. How many of you are aware of the BU campus? You've been over there, surely, been by it. There's a concrete slab tower that looks over the Charles River, and it's the BU Law School. It's probably done in '68, I'd guess. Yeah, probably. And one of the things about these concrete buildings is number one, they're so difficult to modify and transform the way you can a normal building.
Yeah.
And it didn't have enough space. So what they did was and this is maybe what the right solution at City Hall ultimately will be, is it became part of a larger complex. In other words, they're adding on a big, large floor plate lower section that can accommodate many of the uses that that the CERT building cannot, and therefore maybe then the smaller dimension of the tower can serve purposes that are probably faculty offices and smaller things like that, and probably work out all right. He lived at, and we're getting onto a topic that I shouldn't get onto because most of these folks don't know who we're talking about, but CERT's work is at the more rational, market-driven end of that spectrum, as opposed to the most structurally expressive and idiosyncratic things.
I agree.
Anyway, one more thing here. We talked about, you've alluded to planning and economic development in your slides and in the evolution of your professional life. In Boston, a lot of people say that the Boston Redevelopment Authority, as the planning and economic development agency of Boston, are too intimately connected, that planning is subservient to economic development. What do you think, and what is the right way to think about that? Because other cities like San Francisco have exactly the opposite structure, and they have the same problems that we have. Do you know what I'm saying? In other words,
I believe they're intricately linked. I don't think the solution to what people are objecting to about the recent history of the Boston Redevelopment Authority is solved by saying planning is going to be an agency over here and I'm going to have an economic development agency over there. I think what happened in the BRA is that the ability to create jobs and tax revenue that the planners who were the project managers for the economic development projects ended up having so much more currency that the planning got lost, but I think it takes leadership. Right. And otherwise I think what happens is you just pit agencies against one another, and it's, to me, good planning is economic development. It takes into consideration what are the costs and benefits of a particular project, a real estate development, a program, et cetera. So I don't think separating them is a solution to the problems.
Just to be clear, what the problem is that economic development, oftentimes people will say, well, especially if you're in a go-go city like Boston, where, Boston and San Francisco and New York and Chicago have a completely different kind of set of problems than most American cities, indeed most post-industrial cities in the world, which are desperate to have more investment, desperate to have more real estate development occurring in them. But Boston and San Francisco are the two prime examples of places where there's mostly plenty of demand. The question is where to shape it, where to put it, where to let it get big. And if you let economic development dominate the conversation, some people say, well, buildings get too big, the scale gets too suffocating, Boston ceases to have the character of its traditional sense. On the other hand, if everything is about planning and I just make a 30,000-foot watercolor image of what the future of the city should look like, and it doesn't comport with economic reality at all, none of that will happen either.
But when you have something like the High Spine in Boston, or the Walk to the Sea, or those are planning concepts that can then seed economic development in a way where it can be part of a bigger plan, but it can still produce the benefits that economic development can produce.
Kate, do you have some questions for us? All right. We're going to get some from the audience here.
Nobody asked me what I think about casinos.
Oh boy, yeah. Maybe we should.
In what ways do you test or prototype your designs and ideas before committing to a final plan as to create a more suitable landscape for the area?
Yeah, that's interesting.
Well, I think most projects that I've worked on the campuses start with a scope of what you're trying to achieve. So I think this gets back to identifying the problem that you're trying to solve for, and then it's always advisable to have more than one option so you can compare and contrast. Too often I think the options are low, medium, high cost, as opposed to inverted, extroverted, will take a long time, will not take a long time. The more you can have all of those different ingredients and do a sort of sensitivity analysis, with a team that has the appropriate engineers, appropriate designers, appropriate stakeholders, then you're likely to come up with, from that process, one hopes that you come up with a solution that has the best of all of those inputs.
And by the way, before we get this second one, what do you think of casinos? You all know that there's a big hot issue in Massachusetts right now about whether or not we will have casinos in the state.
From a physical planning point of view, I think the casino in Everett is going to create tremendous problems in Sullivan Square. So I worry about the transportation infrastructure being able to support. So I'll just speak as a physical planner and not give my social opinion. But I will get to vote, as will any of you if you're registered in Massachusetts.
Okay, Kate.
Could permitting fraternity or sorority houses on campus help the issue on Mission Hill and surrounding areas?
I think that's a question for you all. If there was a fraternity house on campus, well, it would only make sense if people turned the other way from consumption of alcohol, drugs, the other things that if you're living in a dorm, you're not allowed to have, right? So I don't think it matters whether it's a fraternity or it's a dorm. The fact is that when you're off campus, you are your own
keeper.
Exactly. And sometimes, because you're young, not living with your parents anymore, like to have a good time. All of that is really good. I have a son who went to George Washington University and was up for judicial discipline a number of times. Not because he did anything criminal or bad, just because he partied loud and underage drinking and things that I'm sure none of you ever take part in.
No, they filled out a questionnaire. None of them have ever done that.
So first of all, there's no space on campus for fraternities, so forget it. There's so many other things that have to happen on the limited land that we own. But it's a question, because I don't think you're at a stage in your lives where you should be told you can't party. And I do think that there's things about the age that you can drink, et cetera, that don't acknowledge what young people are doing, and that's a problem. But I also understand why the university student affairs position is they can't condone something that's against the law.
Others?
Are you affiliated with the Ruggles Station $20 million renovation that was just announced, and what is the plan for it? Is there any application of those funds to renovating the architecture studio below it?
The answer to the last question is probably not. Most of that $20 million is going to go to an extension of the platform that the MBTA is doing because they want to have more cars on the commuter rail to bring people who mostly are working in Longwood Medical Area. So that's the genesis of the project. However, it turns out that, yes, Northeastern has been lobbying for some of that money to be spent on station improvements, but it turns out that the American for Disabilities Act is going to require that by extending the platform, they have to do things to retrofit the station. So I think there is a great opportunity to try and have that money spent in a way that there are capital improvements that people who use that as a pathway will experience the benefit of as well.
Good. It looks like we have another question here.
Hi, good afternoon. I just want to ask about the new building that's going up now. First, what's the plan for the current engineering, like Snell and Dana Research and all that? Because when they move over, what's going to happen to those two buildings?
It's not to replace space that's on the campus now.
It's just to
It's to accommodate what's called the long-range plan at Northeastern, to add research faculty and graduate students and postdoc students. So it's primarily going to be new people recruited to the campus. If there are moves and swaps, it'll be in conjunction with being able to improve the places that are in Snell or Egan or any of the existing buildings.
Okay.
And so is it intended to replace?
I was actually wondering also about the bridge, because you talked about it a lot, but it seems like there would be actually a lot of problems with doing that. Like the MBTA owns the the area above the train, correct?
Yes, they do.
And it seems construction-wise that'd be hard to do.
Yes, it is.
So I was just wondering if you could talk about the planning of that sort of stuff.
It's very complicated from an engineering point of view, from a political point of view, from a cost point of view, but it's one of these big ideas that's really important to happen. So you have the MBTA, you have commuter rail, and you have Amtrak, and they all have engineers who we have to pay to review our plans to make sure that what we're doing is not going to disrupt what they want to do. Fortunately, they need to take an easement on Northeastern's land in order to do their platform work. So it gave us the opportunity that they needed something from us, and we needed something from them, which is the air rights to do the bridge. And of course, the bridge is going to be publicly accessible, so it isn't just for Northeastern's benefit. But the idea of spending that kind of money on that bridge is to have a pathway that goes from Centennial Commons and the health sciences to the Robinson Quad. So this building becomes in the middle of where the scientists are already, and the students are already working.
Please.
Hi, I was just curious how often the topic of like small scale sustainable energy production, like whether it's solar panels or small wind turbines, et cetera, comes up in conversations about campus planning and urban planning in general, in your experience.
A lot. At Northeastern, a lot. I have to say that it sort of surprises me that sustainability is one of the 3 major research topics, and what I see happening in the facilities area doesn't seem to be connected either to students who are interested in the topic or to the research topic, but there's an energy group within facilities that reviews everything that's happening in our capital plan, which means all of the building costs, looking for opportunities to retrofit, to save money. The planning that we're doing along Huntington Avenue to think about landscape and making the campus more permeable all comes through the lens of what is sustainable building and landscape practice. So it's extremely important. You know, being an urban campus, I think one of the big sustainability challenges for us is getting people out of their cars. So as the new science building replaces on surface parking, and the Camden parking lot on Camden Street is going to go away because there's a proposal to build fields to improve the city's Carter playground and also build a field that Northeastern can share. There's a lot of complaints that the parking is going to be limited, it's going to get more expensive, and all of those things are about using the land that we have and the campus that we have in a way that's continually more sustainable.
Okay, thanks.
So I know solar panels are hard because of the nature of the roofs and equipment on the roofs, so there hasn't been that much experience with that, but there's the new building in particular is being built in a way that the glazing and the systems in the building are all geared towards limiting the amount of energy consumption and, you know, driving towards limiting the carbon footprint of the campus.
Yeah. Let's have one more.
In what ways do you work with the city government when planning a collegiate campus?
Well, in Boston, the institutional master planning requirements means we can't build anything without working with the Boston Redevelopment Authority. On the Carter Playground, we can't do anything without working with the Parks Department. The Inspectional Services Department, which grants you a building permit, always goes back to the Boston Redevelopment Authority to ask if it's consistent with our master plan. And then there's the elected officials. And we basically can't do anything if the elected officials feel that their constituents living in the surrounding neighborhoods are not going to be well served by it. So I work with the city a lot.
It's probably instructive to know that Boston, for all practical purposes, basically does not have as-of-right zoning at all. There's hardly anything that you can do completely as of right, certainly at any scale. And that means every building or project or campus in Boston is a negotiation. It's messy, but it does maybe keep the stakeholders more engaged than other ways.
And the reality is that once you have your institutional master plan, all of the underlying zoning goes away, and your plan becomes your zoning. So if you're good at it, and you're able to anticipate what you need to do, you actually can get going more rapidly. But inevitably, I think BU submitted their master plan within 3 months. They had to go in and get it amended because it turned out their building project was going to be something different than what they said. So it doesn't quite buy you 10 years of freedom.
Well, with that, I want to thank you so much, Kathy,
Welcome.
for coming.
Thank you.